was making fun of mainstream economists when I said that. After the 2008 crisis, even the Queen of England was like asking economic advisors, how come you guys didn't see this coming? Nobody even told me this was a possibility. What the heck happened? One of the things that Nobel laureate economists said in response to her, imagine if a plane crashed and then people are looking at the engineers and, the air traffic control guys and all these other people, and they said, what the hell? How come you guys didn't catch this? If a plane crashes, the people beforehand who got on the plane and took off didn't know it was going to crash. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gotten on the plane. See, in mainstream mathematical economics, we have what's called the efficient markets hypothesis. And it says that stock prices reflect all of publicly available information. It can't possibly be that anybody could predict a stock market crash coming, because if people knew in the year 2007, in 12 months' time, the market was going to crash, what would they do? They would get rid of their stocks. And so that would have pulled the crash forward. They're saying, we've known that anytime there's a stock market crash, it couldn't possibly have been predicted, because otherwise it wouldn't have happened. So people saw the 2008 crisis coming, it wouldn't have happened in 2008. Through that argument, some of them actually went so far as to say,
Mr. Murphy, welcome back. Haven't seen you in a while.
thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I think last time we spoke was in London at the art conference.
Yes.
Back in 23?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yep.
Yeah, okay. Man, time flies. Here we are, January 26th. Hard to believe. As I was just sharing with you offline, I've been working on this book for quite some time, and praxeology, the logic or science of human action, has become a very central, it is the central theme of the book. And I guess it's kind of born out of this, I don't want to call it a frustration, but, I think Austrian economics is so important. And the work of Mises, I consider Mises to be the most underappreciated philosopher in history at this point. I really think no one knows who he is. No one even looks at him as a philosopher hardly. He's, if you know who he is, you think he's just an economist.
Right.
And I'm hoping through this book to argue how profound and important his ideas are, and hopefully make them more accessible. My not a critique. I hesitate to critique any of the Austrians, but their writing can be a little bit dense, a little bit difficult for, a lay audience, let's say. But the ideas underneath, the axiom of action and all of its, everything that we deduce from it is just so important to everything. I really consider it to be foundational. So I'm hoping today, obviously you're the guy, right? You wrote the book Choice, which I think, as you explained to me, someone was asking you to do something like that, right? Take Mises's human action and make it accessible, basically. And I've read your book Choice. We've talked about it a little bit before. But I'm hoping in this conversation today that we can just go through some of these more difficult aspects of praxeology and make them approachable in a way that people can appreciate and see how fundamental they are.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great, Robert. And yeah, you're right. It was the book Choice, the Independent Institute is the publisher. And yeah, David Thoreau, who's no longer with us at the time, approached me and said, hey, we have this project in mind that human action, we think is, the most, or of the 20th century, most important economics book. It's difficult. It's 900 plus pages, and the writing is dense. Give us something that's 300-ish pages that could be an undergrad assignment. And I said, okay. Yeah. And that's what that book is.
Yeah. And I would highly recommend it. For most people, I would not send them straight to human action. I don't know, unless they're very, if they've got a very sophisticated background in reading difficult books. The way he uses, and I think this story is something like this, correct me if I'm wrong, but Mises didn't even learn English until his 40s or 50s.
I think that's true. And yeah, originally, so what we think of as the book Human Action, he originally wrote is National Economy. I'm not, I don't have a good German accent. Yeah. I think in 1940 he wrote that. And then it wasn't just a translation. My understanding is, once he was better at English, he literally just rewrote what we call Human Action, which came out in 49. that covers a lot of the same material. But yes, you could even hear lectures. Like, I don't know if you've ever heard Mises actually give a talk. There's not that much footage of him, but there is a thing floating around. I think it was in the 60s, and the title of it is Why Socialism Always Fails. But even there, I mean, he's funny and he's glib and everything, but he's got a pretty thick accent. So even at that point, decades after he was in the US and lecturing and whatnot. So
yes. Yeah. And it comes out in his writing. Like, it's, in one way, it's very impressive the way he handles English, but that also has this kind of heavy Germanic influence, I guess, and just the arrangement of words. And it's difficult, but also mind expanding at the same time. And I would say especially the first 100 pages of that book, Human Action, are just very philosophical, like
incredibly. Yeah. If I could take a moment just to, because I think this is partly what you want me to do here, is unpack some of that yes, it's funny. So as you say, most people think of Mises as an economist, and most people go to Human Action. It's called Human Action. The subtitle is A Treatise on Economics. And so you're thinking, okay, he's going to start telling me about money and the business cycle and taxes. And you're right in the beginning, he's giving, the methodological foundations, like what's the scope and boundaries of economic science, and how do we proceed? How do we learn things about economic law? And he spends a lot of time on that. And so what happened is, when I was younger, I would tell people, they did get Human Action. They said, I'm lost. And I would just say, skip ahead to, chapter, I forget off the top of my head, but I would tell them to skip the first part. But then what's funny is, lecturing at Mises University for years, I've had people come up to me, and if they have a philosophy background, like there are some philosophy undergrads who love Mises, and they say, oh, my favorite part of Human Action is part 1.
Yeah.
Because they just find it very refreshing. And like, wow, this guy, like, he's familiar with all the literature. He's read Hume and Kant and all these things, but he's coming at it, with his own idiosyncratic approach. And that's really refreshing. So anyway, Mises is as good in these other disciplines as, I mean, maybe he doesn't have brand new concepts that he's introduced the way he does in economics, but yes, he's very adept at discussing what at his time was modern philosophy, and like knows all the literature and history of it.
Yes. And I think the other thing that strikes me is that he is very humble. Hoppe takes a lot of his claims kind of to the next level, but I think Mises was just trying to say, these are the things we know, and he's just establishing a very firm foundation for praxeology and economics. But the implications of the things he was saying, I don't think we've fully absorbed that yet, and that's part of what I want to talk with you about today. Can
I just say, Robert, I'm sure this will come out, but just to make sure we don't forget to say that, right, I did not, as I alluded to a minute ago, when I was younger, like I just thought, oh yeah, you got to read Human Action because you have to understand the Austrian theory of the business cycle, or you got to understand how do you apply subjective utility theory to money. Like those are two things that Mises, was the man on, and he kind of invented or created. But the other stuff, I was like, yeah, you take it or leave it, whatever. And even Israel Kirzner, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I studied under him at NYU, and he, I would talk to him in his office because I had problems with Mises' theory of interest. And Kirzner was kind of, I don't remember his exact wording, but I got the sense he was saying like the a priori stuff wasn't a big deal to him. You could take it or leave it. He cared about the content, like whether you think it's apodictically true or just empirically it is true. Who cares? The important thing is what's the substance of Mises' economics. And it wasn't until I read Hoppe's Economic Science and the Austrian Method that I, like you're saying, Robert, that I really like it hit me. And I was like, whoa, this is so deep. Like, I don't even care about the business cycle. This is like solving the mind body problem. This is crazy, man. So anyway, it's audacious where Hoppe tries to take it. So you can either say he's wrong or not, but you're right. What Mises is just trying to do is to give a solid foundation to economics, which is the point of his book. Hoppe realizes, oh no, Mises got a lot of work done with those moves he made.
Yes. No, I'm glad you said that. The mind-body problem, there's several other of these dichotomies we inherited from the Enlightenment, like fact, value, is, ought, theory, data, even subject, object. And this is part of what's in the book, but I think there is that action or praxeology, looking at the world through that lens, actually reconciles a lot of those dichotomies. And without going into any of those particular rabbit holes, the lightning bolt that hit me in reading Hoppe's, we'll call it ESAM for short, Economic Science and Austrian Method. It's around, I think it's page 20. He says something like, it is only through action that mind and reality come into contact.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just almost, it was every sentence in that book's very important. It's a very short essay / book, but it's very dense, as Hoppe tends to do, very meaningful, a lot of meaning packed into every sentence. But even that one, I was like, oh man, I think even Hoppe's being a little too humble here. Is like he's reconciling subject-object duality through action, basically. It's like, oh, action is the thing that's prior to us. It's the pre-categorical split for us. Before we divide the world into subjects and objects, it's the acting mind that's doing that, almost as if words themselves, categories themselves are means to an end. So that action is, superordinate or ontologically prior to all these things, all these other philosophical concepts and notions.
I think you're right. I would have to play around with that a bit, but yeah, that sounds right to me. I'm wondering, Robert, should we maybe just define what we mean by action so we're not completely losing people?
Sorry, we're still kind of just doing a little pregame here, but I wanted to start broad. I'll start with what I thought was the broader question, but you can take it any direction you like. And it really just was going to be, what makes a science a science? Because the big argument here, and a lot of what you were talking about in that podcast episode that inspired me to want to talk to you again, which again was titled, this is the Human Action Podcast, which you are the host of. Your November 27th, 2025, episode 526, titled, What Makes Economics Scientific? And so there's a lot of people, I would say it's almost the general perspective on economics. And obviously this is tainted with a lot of Keynesianism, that economics isn't actually scientific, right? It's just, it's a political thing. And we try to assign laws to this inherently messy social domain. So there's not any actual logic or scientific rigor to it. And the Austrian school, I'm sure we both agree, that's where all the rigor and logic actually is as it applies to economics. So the question is, what makes a science? And how does that relate to, I guess, regularities and or predictive / explanatory power?
Okay. Yeah. Great question. So I can't remember the exact thing that set off the argument on Twitter, but the reason I picked that topic at that time was that was a controversy that was raging, like I said, at least on Twitter. I don't know if it was on other platforms as well. And it wasn't about the Austrians per se. It was just mainstream mathematical economics versus the heterodox community. So if you had to classify it, you would probably put the Austrians in the heterodox camp. But usually when you use that phrase, people have in mind Marxists and the neo-Ricardians and things like post-Keynesians, people that, think, oh, everything's real open-ended. And, for them, that's a lot of reason for government intervention because the private sector, it bounces off the walls and everything, and there's no regularity to it. But what the Austrians share with the other heterodox people is a disdain for the guys at MIT and Harvard and Chicago. Even though they have their ideological differences, they do hold up this body of what we call neoclassical economics with, it's a bunch of mathematical models that are very crude. So mathematicians will look at the math involved in, quote, cutting edge mathematical economics and say, this is ridiculous. You guys are stuck, back decades ago. And the same thing with physicists. And so what the argument I was making in that episode, just real briefly, is that if what you think scientific means looks like physics or chemistry, and that's what a lot of the mainstream economists, led by Paul Samuelson in the 20th century, that's what they were trying to do, especially coming out of the Depression. They were like, hey, everyone likes the physicists. They're, building weapons and stuff. So why don't we make economics as scientific as that? And so what do you do in physics? Well, you have some conjectures about how nature works. And then you go, you get some testable predictions from your theories. And then you go get some data and you look and see. And, even that story is a little bit simplistic. That's not in reality how it works, but that's kind of the story. And so that's what they thought economics had to be like. And that doesn't work. If that's what you think economics is supposed to be, then it's woefully inadequate, among other things, very few economists saw the 2008 crisis coming. Okay. And so, and they were confident that it wasn't coming too, right? It wasn't just that they were saying who can say. It was like they were very confident. If you go see like clips of Ben Bernanke before the '08 crisis, he's like, oh, everything's fine. There's some froth in the subprime sector. Everything's good. So that's the sense in which, if that's what you mean, then economics is not scientific and they're just bamboozling the public. But the Austrian tradition, specifically like the Misesian one, he wants to say, no, economic law, it's not like laws of physics. It's more like geometry. So it is science. To answer your question, Robert, you're saying, is it scientific? It is if what you mean is very rigorous and, there's reproducible steps you can do. It's not just resting on the authority of gurus, but there's an internal logic to it and it's pristine and so forth, just like geometry, for example. Okay. So that's the idea. And so then in the Misesian framework, you start with the action axiom. We can talk a minute about that if you want to unpack it at this point or wait. And then you can logically deduce things of economic law. And to mainstream economists, that sounds like medieval scholasticism. And what are you guys doing? This is crazy. No, that sounds like religion. But I think, as we go through this conversation, Robert, I can argue that, no, actually, that is the solid core of true economics. And if you're trying to do it like these mainstream guys, it's going to blow up in your face, as history has shown.
Yes, exactly. I do find the analogy or metaphor of geometry to be especially useful. It's something most people have done at some point, right? Middle school, high school. And, to say that a triangle has three sides, this is something that's true by definition rather than true by, we made a hypothesis that triangles have three sides, and we went out into the world for many decades and tested all the triangles we could find and couldn't find any exceptions. So then we decided, okay, triangles have three sides, right? That's the domain of empiricism, whereas mathematical or geometric truth tends to reside more in the domain of rationalism. Should we talk about the difference between those two things? And what is it about economics or praxeology that lends itself to the domain of rationalism rather than empiricism?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's going to get to, especially if you want to talk about Hoppe and what he thinks Mises did. This stuff's going to be important to go through. Right. So I think, yes, you could certainly start with the definitions, but there people might think, oh, okay, definitions, but something, the best example I think we use is the Pythagorean theorem. So in case people don't remember what that is, picture a right triangle, right? So a triangle that's got a 90-degree angle in it. And then A and B are the shorter sides and C is the long, the diagonal, the hypotenuse. And so the Pythagorean theorem proves that in normal geometry, A squared plus B squared equals C squared. All right. Now that's not obvious that should be true, right? That doesn't just seem to jump out at you from the definition of what a triangle is. And there's millions of different ways you can prove it. But the important point is, notice what I said. I said, prove it. And there's a sense in math, or, in particular geometry, where when you prove something, that's stronger than just saying something like, oh yeah, Einstein showed that we can't go faster than the speed of light. A lot of people would agree with that, but he could be wrong. Whereas Pythagoras couldn't have been wrong about what his theorem said. You can come up with things that's called non-Euclidean geometry where it's not true, but the point is you're changing the rules. But in terms of standard geometry, what we mean in the definitions and axioms, yep, A squared plus B squared equals C squared. And the way you would prove it in a class is you can go up on the board and do stuff, and you can put two triangles together and then it turns into a rectangle and you can do stuff like that. You can kind of figure it out. But what, like you're saying, Robert, what you absolutely would not do is give the kids a bunch of rulers and say, now go out in the world and go sample 1,000 right triangles. You get a protractor, make sure it's 90-degree angle in there, because otherwise it doesn't hold. And then measure and just come back and tell me, here, take a calculator, because it might be hard to do the squares in your head, and just come back and tell me what you find. And what if a kid finds a counterexample? He says, yeah, this triangle didn't work. The teacher's not going to say, oh, I guess it's wrong. They're going to say, no, you did the numbers wrong, or you didn't measure it right, or what. You see what I'm saying? So,
well, that's not a triangle. Yeah.
Right. So that's the thing, because again, the way you prove stuff in geometry is not at all quote, the scientific method, the way we mean it in the empirical natural sciences, like physics or chemistry. And so that's, and so you can say, oh, is it just flowing from the definitions? here, Robert, like, do you want me to get into the synthetic a priori stuff right now, or do you want to postpone that?
I'm ready when you are.
Okay. Yeah. Why don't we? Yeah. So,
and obviously define those because no one knows
right,
what that is. Yeah.
Right. So Immanuel Kant, very famous philosopher, he came up with these categories, like a taxonomy, the different buckets you could put statements in. And so one dividing line was analytic versus synthetic. And I'm going to give like the intuitive. So the idea was if a statement's analytic, you can kind of just analyze the terms, right? It's really just talking about language and the definitions we use. Whereas synthetic means it's like about the world at large. Like it's telling us something about reality. So a standard definition is to say like a bachelor is an unmarried male. Is that true or false? Oh, I know it's true. But how do you know it's true? Just from analyzing the terms, right? That's what a bachelor means, is an unmarried male. So yes, it's a true statement, but it's not like, I learned something where to say the sun is hot, that's more of a synthetic statement. You know what I mean? Like that doesn't, like the term sun doesn't also mean hot, right?
Yes.
And then a different distinction he made was between a priori and a posteriori statements. And so a priori has to do with like, you can just know it through introspection. You don't need to have experience. Whereas a posteriori means you kind of need experience. So the way to remember is like a priori, like it's got the word prior in there. So it's kind of like prior to you living your life, could you know the truth of this?
Yeah, okay? Without priors, right? And I always think about before the fact and after the fact, basically.
Yeah.
A priori is before the fact, posteriori is after. Yeah.
And so that's, those are the things. And so the question was, could there be, and so philosophers like those things, and then you can interact with them. And so you can have statements that could be analytic a priori or analytic a posteriori, things like that. And so then the question was, could there be such a thing as a synthetic a priori statement or a true one, let's say? And a lot of philosophers thought, no, that's an empty set, that you couldn't, because what would that mean? It would mean that, it's making a statement about reality that's not merely flowing from the definitions or the terminology we adopted, like a convention, because that's otherwise it would be analytic. So if it's synthetic, that means like it's telling us something about reality. But to say a priori means we don't need to go make a bunch of observations. We don't need to go, like, rely on our experience. We can just kind of think about it and know that it's true.
Yes. Sorry, just to add, that's I think where there's a bit of a paradoxical thing here in a way, right? To say a synthetic statement is something about the world, but to arrive at this proposition about the world without making any actual observations of the world, something that you just establish through self-reflection, right?
Right.
And that seems, on the surface at least, undoable or unattainable.
Right. And it's good that to you that does seem like dubious at best. Yeah. Like, because that means you've understood the terminology. Because and so yes, many philosophers, once they understood that, those terms, thought there is no such thing as a true synthetic a priori statement. They thought that doesn't even make sense. And so what Hoppe argues in Isam is that in the Misesian framework, statements in praxeology are synthetic a priori, and if you did your logic correctly, are true synthetic a priori statements. And so meaning it's not merely rearranging our definitions. It's not merely saying a bachelor is an unmarried male. I'll put it this way. Sorry, before we get into the economics, let me just dwell on the geometry a little bit. So you can imagine if like Martians or people from, aliens from a different galaxy showed up, and we figure out how to communicate with them, and we're swapping like, hey, what have you figured out? Here's what we figured out. If we told them a bachelor is an unmarried male, all they would really be learning is facts about our language. They wouldn't know anything about the universe, right? Whereas like maybe if they hadn't discovered quantum mechanics and we showed them that stuff, they might say, oh, now we know how atoms work. We didn't know. Okay, thanks. Whereas if you showed them the Pythagorean theorem, if they had never just stumbled upon that, they might be like, oh, wow, that's amazing. Who would have thought? And yet you can see there's a sense in which, the theorem is packed into our definition of a triangle and like the logical structure of how our mind works. You know what I mean? Like it's not like, again, it's not that you go out and measure a bunch of triangles and figure out this empirical, the way with quantum mechanics. Like, we've done a bunch of experiments, and I know it sounds crazy, but this looks like how particles behave at a small scale. Go figure. Whereas with the Pythagorean theorem, we could show them the proof, and I guess we're assuming their minds work like ours. Like they might just say, I don't think that follows. And what would we do? But assuming their minds work like ours, they would say, oh, wow. And so that's the sense. Now, to be clear, I think a lot of philosophers think geometry is analytic. I don't want to mislead people, but I'm saying to me, like that's where you're definitely in the borderline, at the very least, where it looks like you're saying a lot more than just, oh, a triangle has three sides with the interior summing to 180 degrees. Like it looks like you're learning something about reality that you didn't know before. And that the aliens would be grateful for us to show them the theorem. Whereas we just told them a bachelor's an unmarried male. That's trivia about the human language.
Yes. Okay. So would it be proper to say, I agreed, geometry is in general analytic, but the axioms of geometry are at least presumed to be synthetic, right? Somehow it grabs onto the world, right? At some point, not to say that Euclidean geometry or non-Euclidean geometry is correct, but that's at least, there has to be some point between the formal system, of geometry, let's say, where it interfaces with the informal system of reality. So we do have to presuppose that the axioms themselves are synthetic at some point. Would that be correct to say?
Okay, so for sure, I understand what you're asking me. I don't know.
By the way, I think this is like an unsolved mystery. I don't expect you to have an answer here, but it's like it's something you have to presuppose about mathematics if you think mathematics is going to be effective at doing things in the world.
Right. Okay. Yes. So here I'm guessing, because like I said, I'm not a philosopher, so I haven't studied like all the different people and what they think. I do want to tell you, it's coincidentally, Robert, within like the last 2 weeks, I stumbled upon something I'll tell you in a minute in terms of a philosopher who thought he had a good example of a synthetic a priori that has nothing to do with economics. But certainly I think the way a lot of modern, like I know David Friedman, all right, because I debated him at PorcFest one year on economic, like methodology in economics. And, he was kind of taking the physics route and I was taking this route. And yeah, he was saying that it's ironic that, Murphy here is holding up geometry, Euclidean geometry, as the model for how Austrian economics operates, because in physics, we know that the world actually isn't Euclidean, right? Like the space-time is curved. It's not flat the way it is in your XYZ, stuff in your textbooks when you learn Euclidean geometry. And so, right, I'm sure the way he would handle it if he, listened to our conversation up till now is he would say, yeah, that, the Pythagorean theorem is true in the axiomatic framework, but you're right to say, like, it's a valid argument, but it rests on the truth of the conclusion, rests on the truth of the assumptions or the axioms. And it just turns out that the axioms of Euclidean geometry are approximately correct, but not exactly correct. And like the world space-time empirically is non-Euclidean. And so it's close enough that, like, that's why engineers, it helps them, before you go build a bridge, you need to know basic geometry, right? That's going to help you in your architecture classes and whatnot. But strictly speaking, and if you're near a black hole, you're going near the speed of light or blah, 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 like standard geometry would fail you. I think that's what a modern physicist would say.
What if I told you that you could lower your tax bill and stack Bitcoin at the same time? Well, by mining Bitcoin with Blockware, you can. New guidelines from the Big Beautiful Bill allow American Bitcoin miners to write off 100% of their mining hardware investment in a single year. That's right, a 100% write-off. So if you had $100,000 of income or capital gains, you could write off that entire amount by investing it in Bitcoin mining hardware. Blockware's mining as a service allows you to start mining Bitcoin right now with minimal effort. Blockware handles everything from securing the miners to sourcing low-cost energy to configuring the mining pool. They do it all. You can stack Bitcoin at a discount every day and save big when tax season comes. So you can get started today by going to mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. Again, that's mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove.
Yes. So, and this is where it might be a good bridge into the axiom of action, because because there was a long period of time, right? Euclid wrote Elements, 500-600 years, a long time ago. I could be way off on the time, but it was written a long time ago. For a long time, we assumed that there was only Euclidean geometry, right? So there's only really one form of geometry. So these axioms were true and everything we deduced from them. You know, two parallel lines never touch.
Right.
You know, between any 2 points, you can draw a line segment. You know, whatever the axioms are. That was presumed to be all that there was, but then eventually along comes non-Euclidean geometry. We figure out, hey, we can change actually the axioms or the rules or the constraints, which they all kind of share a similar flavor here, right? How do you constrain what we're deducing from them? And you can get, you know, non-Euclidean geometry, which is equally true, or maybe true in, well, depending on how you're looking at the universe. I guess in a post-Einsteinian world, non-Euclidean geometry is more true. Pre-Einstein, or in a Newtonian world, Euclidean geometry is more true, something like that. But the difference here is that when you look at praxeology and the axiom of action, there doesn't seem to be a way to establish an alternative axiom at all. Like, it seems to be an absolute axiom in many ways. And this is where we're going to need to unpack and define what is action, what is the axiom of action. But if you could do that, and then just talk about how that's like, it's I don't know, you may not agree. It seems to me like there's no imaginable way to formulate something that could contradict the axiom of action or overturn or be an alternative to the axiom of action. So yeah, if you'll just kind of define those things and then maybe think through the potentially absolute nature of action as such.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let me just comment before we totally leave the math geometry world and flip over to economics and action. Right. So I think it was in the 1800s, I might be off, where they developed non-Euclidean geometry. And just so your listeners have an idea, like, what would that even mean? Picture like a globe, right? And the lines, like there's latitude and longitude on that. And so you can imagine like lines starting at the North Pole and then going down to the South Pole. And so if you're at the equator, they'd be a certain distance from each other, but then as you get towards the poles, they get closer. And so those things on the curved surface of the Earth, if you said, what's a parallel line?
Right.
It would look like that. And at the equator, it would seem like they were, these lines are whatever, 10 miles apart. Okay. And then you go up north or south a little bit and they're still about 10 miles. But the more you went, they would get closer and closer. And so that's the sense in which, like you said, Robert, in non-Euclidean geometry, parallel, like straight lines that are parallel, like they can intersect and things. And so, yeah, it makes sense if it's on a curved surface. So now, of course, it's not like that just proved, what am I trying to say? Like people in the year 800, especially mathematicians, like they knew what a globe looked like. You know what I mean? Like they could talk about a sphere and like make calculations. You know what I mean? So it's not like nobody knew what a sphere was. It's just in terms of like, they realized, you can axiomatically do geometry. Like I think in the 1800s, they developed this alternate system, with polar coordinates and stuff like that. Okay. So that's the sense in which we mean. And yeah, you can do, and it's valid. You can prove things with that different axiomatic framework. And then also like with mathematics in general, there were different axiomatic frameworks they were giving it and trying to like people, it was a big project that they were trying to do. And I'm going somewhere with this, Robert, that's relevant, to try to like take all of math and put it on a logically, deductive framework footing, right? To say, can we reduce all of math down to a few axioms and then just logically deduce every true mathematical proposition from those axioms, at least in principle. And then, that we'd have a firm foundation. So if you had a problem with any of the propositions, you would just go to the axioms and say, well, you think any of those axioms are wrong? And if you don't, then there. So as I'm sure you and many of your listeners have heard of, there's this thing called Gödel's theorem. And again, this is what it's going to be relevant to the a priori stuff, that I don't want to get into it. It's really complicated, but and people name drop and term drop that all over the place. But the essence of it was he showed in any kind of a system where you're trying to come up with axioms and then that you can encode mathematical propositions, like stuff like 2 + 2 is 4, but also, there does not exist an integer with these properties. Like you can make, really complicated statements. And he showed as long as it's powerful enough to capture some of those higher level statements, you can always write a sentence that effectively says, this proposition cannot be deduced from the axioms.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, okay, whatever. If you think about that, it's mind blowing because
Yeah.
it's got to be either true or false, right? Because he does it in the notation of the system, right? He doesn't
Yes.
write it in words. He where you could just say like, oh, I'm lying, and oh, the universe didn't blow up. Who cares? But no, he does it like in the notation of the formal system to say, like it's proposition 117, and it says proposition 117 does not cannot be proven from the axioms. Okay, so it's either true or false, right? Because it's in the language of the system. And so if it's false, that means it could be proven true.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want that because that means now the system is inconsistent, right? That you can prove false statements from the axioms. So you don't want that. So that means it's true. That's the only alternative. But then, so now it's saying there's a true mathematical statement that we know cannot be proven from or deduced from the axioms, right?
So it's incomplete.
Right. So that's one way to describe it, is that Gödel showed any formal mathematical, axiomatic system is either inconsistent or incomplete.
Yes.
Okay. And people, do bong hits and talk about that and whatever, and it's mind blowing. But but for our purposes here, the reason I went down that path is I just recently came across, it was in 1949, this guy, Irving Copi, COPI, in the Journal of Philosophy has this article called Modern Logic and Synthetic A Priori. And he said those Gödel statements are obviously synthetic a priori true statements, right? Because he's saying like, what, is it synthetic? Right. And he's like, yeah, I mean, it's mind blowing. It's telling us something about the nature of reality for sure, right? Like it's limiting our, like, look at how important this result is. Clearly it's synthetic. And he said, but it's also a priori, right? It's not that we had to go test a bunch of stuff. And but in the other way he was trying to say it was synthetic too, that in the article, is he was saying it's not merely flowing from the definitions. Right. He was saying it's not, like, that's the whole point, as Gödel showed, here's something that we can know is true, even though it's not coming from our definitions and our axioms.
Yeah.
And so he was saying, what more do you want for something to be a synthetic a priori proposition than that kind of a thing, that kind of an animal? All right. So anyways, that. Okay. So did you want to talk about that anymore? You want me to just jump into economics?
I want to just throw in a comment there because yes, there is so much bong ripping, mind blowing stuff there. But let me just try to like decomplexify it. And when I try to do this, I might, distort things. So please correct me where I'm wrong, but it's something like the idea of generating a formal system in the world, reality being an informal system. Like the process of creating a formal system is not a formalizable process, something like that. And so you end up with, he's saying that no matter what formal system you establish, it cannot be simultaneously complete and consistent, which is paradoxical and weird. But the statement, though, I'd never heard this, that those statements obviously have some grounding, right? How are they more true than the formal system? It's like a formal statement in a way about the informality of a formal system. So you get in these weird loops. But I really like the map territory metaphor here. I think it's so useful. I forget the name of I think he's a Polish philosopher, right? The map is not the territory. And so the map here representing the formal system and the territory representing the informal system. Well, obviously the map can never be the territory because every map sort of emphasizes some details of the territory and excludes a bunch of others. But then in like another weird sense, the map is the territory in that it's made from real materials in the real world and, real human actions and all this. So it's something like the process of generating that map or the formal system is not itself, it's an action, which we can get into, I guess, right? The act of mapping is not itself a formalizable process, if that makes any sense. It gets very hard to talk about these things at this level because you're hitting the boundaries of like categories and logic and words. But for me, that's useful. Is like just thinking that, the map is actually really has a lot to do with our own aims and intentions, right? Like, you used the example of polar coordinates earlier. Well, if you're near the poles, you want to map with polar coordinates, right? That's going to be much more useful. Whereas if you're near the equator, you probably want a more traditional map, latitude, longitude. And so I guess what I'm gesturing towards here is like the action, all of these things seem to have action underneath them. Even the idea of creating formal systems, informal systems, map, territory, etc. There's action underneath all of this. And Hoppe makes that point also in the book, right? Where he's talking about, where basically observation itself is an act. And so all of empiricism, which is, based on, create a hypothesis, test it, observe, and then, have this little feedback loop, disconfirm all the hypotheses you can, whatever you can't disconfirm over time becomes, fact or truth. That even that presupposes and depends upon action as such. So, I guess we should talk about the axiom of action and what we mean, because we're putting a lot of stress on this thing. We haven't really defined it yet.
Okay. So I'll say what it is, and then maybe I'll back up and explain, like, how did Mises realize he had to deal with this when, he was trying to write on economics. So the action axiom says, people act, and it's important to distinguish, though, act means something very specific. You might say behave purposefully, right? And so let me just give different examples. Like, if I take a rock and I throw it up in the air, and it follows like a parabola, you can write out equations and describe its motion, but at no point would you say, like, oh, originally the rock wanted to get away from the ground, but then it changed its mind and got lonely and came back. You just wouldn't even talk like that. It's not even that would be wrong. It would just be nonsense. Like, you would just say, no, we have decided as mechanical physicists or whatever, we're not going to use language like that, of desire and subjective, preferences and things. No, we're just going to treat the rock as part of a mechanical system that has no mind.
The rock is not goal directed.
Yes, exactly. There's no teleology, if people know that big $3 word. Okay. Whereas if you see a plane that takes off and it goes up and then it turns around and comes and lands, you might say something like, oh, maybe somebody got sick, or maybe the pilot forgot something important, or maybe whatever, there's bad weather ahead. You know what I mean? Like, you would be ascribing all of these human motivations to explain that. And so there you'd be talking about action. Or if I see, you and your hand goes and your fingers wrap around a cylinder that's got liquid in it, and you bring it up to your lips and tilt it, I might say, oh, Robert, maybe he's thirsty. And as commonplace as it is, there is a lot packed into me saying that I'm assuming, for one thing, that the molecules that compose your body are under, Robert's direction somehow, which is kind of a mind-blowing idea. And then what the heck is Robert? Well, for our purposes, I'm saying Robert is this bundle of desires. And it's not just that I think you're thirsty, but that you have a theory that you think drinking water will quench your thirst. Because maybe there's poison in there, and actually you don't want to be doing that, and you were mistaken. Right. So I'm just saying there's all kinds of stuff packed into there, but yet we do that so common, that's just a commonplace thing. We don't even really think about it, but that's what Mises means by action. And so everything we do in economics is, following from our decision as the outside observer to attribute intentionality or, subjective preference, or to assume that there's an ego and a mind at work in the world. And we're not just looking at the situation as if it's soulless, mechanical interactions of non-thinking components.
Yes. And this maybe segues into this idea that there are no constants in the sphere of human action. Whereas, like, the example I commonly like to use, you may prefer a different one, but every time we take water to 0 degrees centigrade, it turns into ice. That's a repeatable experiment. It's a hypothesis that we've never been able to disconfirm. Obviously under normal conditions, I guess altitude and salinity and things like that change the freezing point of water, but just omitting all of that. But when you look at human action, there's no, metaphorical 0 degrees centigrade for a human being. Like, a human will respond this specific way every time we give them this specific stimulus. Like, that constant relation doesn't exist. So absent that constancy of relation, you can't build any empirical science. right? Because that's the premise of empiricism, is like, oh, we keep repeating this same process. People do it at different times, different places. It's independently verifiable. It's falsifiable, and no one's been able to falsify it. Therefore, it becomes the body of empirically derived scientific knowledge. But we can't do that with human beings because there's no constants.
Right. Yes. I mean, and this gets in all kinds of stuff. Like, I mean, it goes back at least to Hume talking about the problem of induction, and yeah, it's that was part of the dream, and that's why mathematicians wanted to take everything and put it on an axiomatic deductive framework, because then we would know. Like, that seemed like that was the most airtight way we could know stuff, is when you logically deduce it step by step from axioms that we look at them and just say, those got to be true. How could those axioms not be true? Whereas, yeah, it's even something like, is the sun going to come up tomorrow morning? We think so, but we actually don't know that nearly as much as we know that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? So so there is all that is involved with this stuff too. It's interesting, like, to say, like, how do we know that other people act? And there's difference of opinion. Like, Rothbard, I believe, differed in terms of the grounding of the action axiom itself. So in other words, once you grant that, yes, at least in some settings, it makes sense to say there are human wills at work and we can deduce things from that fact, then the Austrians all agree in the Misesian tradition. But in terms of how do you know that the action axiom is true, I think actually Rothbard differed from Mises. Israel Kirzner said one time that he just flat out asked Mises, how do we know that other people act? And that Mises said, by observation.
Yeah.
Which kind of surprised Kirzner at the time. Like, he wasn't expecting Mises to say that. So, take that for what you will, but it kind of makes sense that, because in other words, why is it, like I said earlier, how come we just have decided that we're not going to say rocks act, but we will say people do? And then you could say, well, what about your dog? Okay, yeah, I definitely treat my dog differently from how I treat, a mud puddle or something. But then what about like a microscopic, like bacteria or something? And you can metaphorically say, oh, look, it's trying to go get the food or whatever, or wants to reproduce, but
yes,
the deeper you go, and then like a virus, and then, certainly you don't think that a helium atom has desires, right?
right.
Or maybe you would, maybe you'd say, oh, the electrons want to do this. They want to get to a higher valence. Who knows? But my point is, like, the deeper you get, then it gets more and more contrived, and people might be tempted to just say, oh yeah, that's just the mechanical laws of physics. But what's weird is, unless you're a dualist, so there's a lot of materialists walking around, and I think that's why they have such trouble with, certain topics, because it's like, ultimately they think people are just bags of atoms walking around, and that there's really nothing there.
Yes. Yeah. No, you quickly drive towards delineating or trying to find the line between living and non-living systems. Right. And, the way I understand this from philosophers is they draw the line at what they call, autopoiesis. Poiesis meaning making or production, auto meaning self. So, a living system is that which seeks out conditions that continue or optimize its ongoing self-organization, whereas a non-living system doesn't do that, right? So a wildfire, right, will just burn through the brush straight up to the water line, and then it will extinguish itself. Whereas if that wildfire were somehow autopoietic or living, it would try to go up the hill and go around the water and try to find more brush, So it's the goal-seekingness or the purposiveness that seems to make living systems living, basically. Which gets back to this whole idea of, like, to act is to be, for living beings, at least. What is it, though, about, I guess we have to even define the word axiom, right? There's like an unshakable assumption. What is it that makes the axiom of action axiomatic? Like, why is it that, we even said this with Euclidean geometry earlier, like, oh, these are axioms that seem to be unshakable for a long time, and then someone came along and said, oh no, we found these other axioms, whole nother geometry over here, pick which one you need based on your circumstances. But that doesn't seem to be the case with the axiom of action. So how is the axiom of action seemingly more axiomatic than any of these other quote unquote axioms?
Right. Okay. So in terms of like what work is the word doing? Yeah, axiom means in this context that it's not something that we're trying to prove or whatever. Like that's the starting point for this analysis.
Yes.
And so so a proof in Euclidean geometry starts with certain axioms, and then you deduce things. You don't ask, is the axiom true or not? I mean, you could after the demonstrations, but the demonstration itself just assumes, for the sake of argument, that those axioms are true, and then it just proceeds to prove things.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what the term, that's the function that it's serving. And so in a social science setting, to say, what is it? It's again, it's flowing from the decision of the analyst to bring intentionality and goal-seeking behavior into the analysis. Because you could, if you wanted to, you could just look at Grand Central Station at noon on a Tuesday, and if you had fine enough resolution, you could just try to look at everything in terms of atoms obeying the laws of physics.
Mm-hmm.
If you like I said, you wouldn't be able to actually get all the information and process it and whatever, but in principle you could, and that'd give you a rough idea of, you could look 10 steps ahead maybe and try to see where the system was going to be. Whereas a different approach is just to say, oh, people are trying to go to lunch, and these people are trying to go home, and why, when this thing happened over when the train pulled in, did a bunch of these things come out? And it's because the people were on the train. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of language you would use that would be implicitly assuming there were people that had goals that you were attributing to. And that's another way you could make sense of that situation.
Right.
And so it's, it's kind of like, if somebody pushed you and said, well, why are you assuming that? How do you know? Like, for all solipsism is a thing. Like somebody could just say, this is all a dream, or this is the Matrix, and these people aren't real, and whatever. So yeah, ultimately, or you could push it and just say free will is an illusion. There's some people that say this. I don't know if they actually believe it, but to say that ultimately, what we all have is, at least I seem to have these internal experiences that go along with my sensory observations. And so when I see other beings acting externally in a similar way to me, it makes sense to say, oh, they probably have internal things going on too, but technically I don't know.
Right.
And so, that's kind of where you get down to. So that's a sense in which it's an axiom that you're just going to decide. And I would say empirically that, you can get so much farther in the social sciences, assuming that there are other egos at work besides your own, than you can if you just try to look at everything mechanically.
Yes. I mean, again, this is where it's like, it sounds maybe complex and esoteric, but it's also deeply intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
I think about people that are, let's say, in the dating market, and a very common question is like, oh, what are you looking for? Are you looking to get married? Are you looking to have casual sex? Are you looking to, I don't know, whatever, polyamory, all the different things people do. It's like you're trying to understand what path of goal-directed action they are trying to be on, to see if it aligns with the same path of goal-directed action that you are trying to be on. If someone wants to get married and someone wants to be polyamorous, it's like, well, that's probably not going to work because you guys are on divergent paths. And so it's something we're doing all the time. It's also in like every game you play. You're playing poker. Well, you want to have the highest hand ranking on the river, right? Mm-hmm. Is that right? Flop, turn, river. Yeah. And, that's a goal, right? But you're also competing. You are at cross purposes with every other player at the table who has the same goal. There can only be one winner at the end. So it's in everything that we do. And to even contemplate, I really like the example of just performative. It's not an example, but just the idea of performative contradiction.
Right.
That, to say something like, I am not speaking English right now.
Right.
It's like, well, obviously I said that was a proposition. Those were words, but I disproved the content of my own proposition with my demonstration of using the English language to say that. And so, it's the classic adage that actions always speak louder than words. And to say, oh, the axiom of action isn't real because of A, B, C reasons. Well, what am I doing? I'm using the means of words and argumentation and I'm using those means to the end of trying to refute the axiom of action. And I am also at the same time presupposing you are an actor, right? Because I'm trying to persuade you. I'm trying to say, oh, you have this opinion. I want you to have that opinion. So it's like, there's no way out of it, right? Even if you're just stopping alone in your own head, not saying a thing, just contemplating it. Like, what is the axiom of action? Like, well, you're using the means of thought toward the end of deeper understanding of yourself or reality or all these things. And so like, they're unlike Euclidean geometry, which is just sort of, there's some, I don't know if this is the right word. There seems to be some degree of arbitrariness in it where you're like, oh, let me say two parallel lines never touch, even though they do touch if it's on curved space.
Right.
This one, there doesn't seem to be any way out of it. Like, it really seems like the ultimate absolute axiom that you can't think your way out of it because thinking is an action. You can't argue your way out of it because argument is an action. You can't observe your way out of it because observation is an action. Like, all of these things just seem to ground out in action. I've heard that answer before where they said, you said Israel asked Mises, how do we know humans act? And he said through observation. But I didn't get that from reading Human Action, actually. And Hoppe goes into more detail about it, saying like, look, all we observe are bodily movements.
Right.
But then the only way we can make sense of those movements and like what people do, how they respond, how they move through the world, the existence of strategy, the existence of argumentation. Hoppe has this whole thing on argumentation ethics. We observe bodily movements, but we have to assume that those are the bodily movements of actors to make sense of the data that we're observing. So it's not technically like you can't directly perceptually observe action. You can observe behavior, but you have to, I don't know if infer is the right word, infer action for those bodily movements to make sense.
Yeah, I'm trying to you said a lot of interesting stuff there. Right. So on the point of could you challenge the action? Whereas, like you say, you can. Let me back up. Let me make sure people understand this notion of a performative contradiction. So just a standard contradiction is just like if somebody said, "Hey, A and not A at the same time," and you say, "You just contradicted yourself."
Yeah.
But if I say Robert Breedlove is not speaking right now, I didn't just utter a contradiction. But if you say Robert Breedlove is not speaking right now, then you that's a performative contradiction.
Right.
Right. And so that, people get the distinction there. And so, yes, in the vein of what's called argumentation ethics, the idea is if you're going to engage in rational argumentation with somebody else, you're bringing to the table, you're presupposing a bunch of norms and things like that. And yes, it does seem, if you're going to say, hello, I would like to argue for the purposes of this debate that people do not act. Action as such is an illusion.
For purposes of.
It's right. Yeah. It seems like that can't be. Now, I suppose you could really push it because like what if somebody recorded, left an old tape recorder or something, and they said some stuff, and then you hit play. You wouldn't say, oh, that tape recorder right now is thirsty. Because what if someone said, hey, I'm really thirsty right now, right? So you can do stuff like that and get kind of cute with it. And then, that could open up the door to, well, yeah, maybe we really are living in the world of the Matrix. And this guy who I think I'm arguing with about does praxeology exist or not, there really isn't someone sitting there arguing with me. But even there, it's like, but the architect, he was a rational being. And for some reason, he wanted to create and have that thing say that to me. For his purposes, whatever, because he wants to fool me and think that I'm still in this thing and, charging his battery or whatever. So you can get cute with that. And I suppose you could push it in the limit, could you be in an empty universe and think you were, but even there, you would still be. So it's, I guess at the very least, I would say if action doesn't exist, then nothing matters anyway. And there's no reason to pursuing that because what's the point,
Yeah. again, even thinking, right? Like even if you're just alone in that universe and you're thinking anything, it's like, well, what did Aristotle say? The purpose of knowledge is action, not knowledge, right? It's like you're using this to do something, otherwise there's no point. And so, yeah, I don't. Where would we leave the? Just the. I guess the thing that I find interesting about the performative contradiction is even in our language, there's like when I say again, I am not speaking English. It's like, what is it that is speaking louder than my words, right? Even that's metaphorical, right? There's nothing speaking, quote unquote, speaking louder than my words, but there is something speaking louder than my words because it's not, you see that it's not true. And that's a sentence that, the example you gave was like, oh, if I say Robert Breedlove isn't speaking, performative contradiction for me, but not for you. But the one, like, if you say it in English,
right.
Obviously, if you say it in Chinese, it's not a performative contradiction. But if you say it in English, it applies to anyone that says it in English. But action's like another level deeper than that because no one could say, I am not acting right now. It's like, well, your very use of words and communication, those are all means, right? These are means to some end that you have, whether that's to communicate or to deceive or whatever. You're still performatively affirming action, even though the content of your words is saying you're trying to deny it.
Yep. Try this again, just because we're getting such deep in the weeds here, totally geeking out. But suppose a different kind of. Imagine that someone's just got like a little voice synthesizer device, and it's just randomly playing like different syllables, and that the thing is just cranking and it's going, for years and years and years, and then it just so happens that the combination it spits out in this one 10-second interval is I am not acting right now. Whereas everything, a few clicks earlier, it was just gibberish. A few clicks later is gibberish. And occasionally it might sound like it said said ball or something, ball, blah, 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 and then I am not acting right now. And it just keeps it. And I suppose in a scenario like that, you could say, oh no, that isn't action. Like that really is just a freak coincidence, just like monkeys happen in the type Shakespeare. And that's, like, there's nothing going on. There's no mind there. It doesn't mean anything. That's just random syllables that give. So I suppose you could come up with contrived scenarios, but again, it kind of comes back to our point. It's, the decision of the observer. Are we going to assume that there's action at work here? And yeah, if I'm in a debate setting with somebody and, and I've talked to the person beforehand and I know he thinks we're there to debate. And he says, no, Mises is full of, he's all wet. I'm going to blow him up in this debate. And then he says, action does not exist. I am quite sure that there's a conscious being there who intends to refute Mises and just failed, contradicted himself in the attempt. So.
Yeah. Even in the contrived example, I've never thought about this before, so it could be wrong, but like, okay, that tape recorder or whatever that was spitting out gibberish, like, well, if we discovered that thing, we wouldn't assume that the universe just randomly generated this tape recorder and spit it out of a star somewhere, right? We'd be like, oh, some conscious being obviously acted to design this thing and build this thing and record whatever's on there. So like, even in these like crazy far out examples, you're still end up in action.
And even the other one that I was riffing off of, like, where they say if you had quadrillions of monkeys all typing and eventually somebody would, type out Romeo and Juliet. In reality, if some monkey sat there and typed out Romeo and Juliet, I don't care how many monkeys we had, but we would say that's a smart monkey. Like that monkey knows how to read. You know what I mean? It has a good memory. So it's like with a lot of these things that, like even when we're trying to break it down, it like in reality, it just doesn't work. So, I agree with you that yes, there is something, it seems fundamental. And I hope the listeners at least can appreciate now what we meant earlier, like how deep this gets, and that yes, even like there, what we're saying, it's what I was trying to isolate was it's not merely your vocal cords vibrating and the words coming out saying, I don't think action exists, or, whatever. I deny the action axiom. That there is one more step where you're associating those facts of the physical world with some being's intentions, and just in that setting, like how could you not? But that's the sense in which Hoppe is saying that action, marries mind and body.
Yes. And the other maybe piece to this is the act of interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if someone says, I am not acting in Chinese, and they say that to you or I don't think you speak Chinese. I don't speak Chinese. They would just say it and I wouldn't know. There'd be no transmission of information because I can't interpret what they're saying. So, but if someone, says that in English, it's like, oh, well, there's an act of interpretation that's decoding that.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, you kind of ground out in action. Let me ask one more thing here, and then we could do a 5-minute break. You said something earlier, like the aim of rationalism was to find these ultimate axioms so that we could really ground our, epistemology and ontology, or knowing in what is real. And so therefore we could like know everything, or, I don't know, have a very tight grip, have a tight epistemological or knowledge grip on the world. But it seems like, again, this is maybe a little bit paradoxical, that when you get to the axiom of action, it's like, well, that does give you the tightest grip on the world as it appears to us humans, right? That we really can only know this thing that we act. And there's a lot, and oftentimes when we start talking about this, it's like there's a lot of implications of this we haven't gotten into yet. We're still just kind of at the foundational layer, which I'm sure we'll get to, but it's really important to get the foundational layer right, in that it doesn't lead you to this like theory of everything, or like, oh, we figured out human action and the axiom of action, so now we're done. We need to, we're all good. We have all the knowledge we need, and that's that. It actually takes you to this kind of opposite place of really radical epistemic humility, and like how little we can actually know. Like we can know these things about ourselves. We know that we use means to pursue ends. But then it's sort of, what does it do? I don't know. It just seems like it, you've talked a little bit about Weinstein and gauge theory and all this like mathematics, where like there's still sort of this, I don't know, a hubris perhaps, where like ivory tower economists think, oh, we can create this model and then we'll understand markets, like when you pull levers and push buttons and control everything, and then we're in utopia. And it's like, praxeology takes you to the opposite conclusion. It's like, that's never going to happen. Like you're never, ever, ever. First of all, you just got a bad metaphor, right? Like the economy is a complex adaptive system. It's not a machine. You're not going to pull levers and push buttons and control the thing, right? It's more like the weather. We can't barely predict it 3 days in advance, much less 30 years. And so it just seems like where the pursuit of rationalism was to get to this kind of like epistemic supremacy, actually through praxeology you end up in a really deep epistemic humility. I don't know if you would agree or disagree with that.
I do agree. And right, because it's almost like once you see the kind of things where you can really be sure and yeah, maybe after the break, we'll get into some specifics about, components of economic law using the deductive method, the kinds of things that I think you can say are airtight true in economic science. And it's not, oh, we ran regression analysis and found that GDP growth was such and such when the taxes were cut by this amount, the kind of thing that mainstream mathematical economists think to be rigorous and scientific. This is how we proceed in our field. And you're right. Once you realize that, no, there's a different way of proceeding when it comes to economics because of the nature of humans and, and how they act. On the one hand, yeah, it makes you real sure about the few things you can say in that realm. But yeah, then you realize by contrast how dubious the foundation is for these other approaches. And that's kind of, that's true in general. Like I said, with the Gödel's theorem, like that really, the reverberations from that, I think, are still rippling through, where people, because in other words, people thought for sure when it comes to math, like propositions in math, that you can really formulate, and not just saying it in words, but like to really get specific and have, formal notation. So any kind of proposition that you can formalize in the language of the system, in the grammar and syntax of the system, surely, it's either provable from the axioms or not, right? And he showed, no, that's not right. And so it really did kind of, blow people's minds. And by the way, just a fun fact about that. My understanding is when Gödel presented that work at some math conference, it was so above the heads of everybody there that later on, when they typed up the notes for what happened at this conference, they didn't even mention that presentation. That's how much. And there was one guy in the audience who came up and asked him questions afterward, and it was John von Neumann, who's like, arguably one of the smartest guys who's ever lived. And so anyway, I'm just saying like how much like people just had no clue what this guy was even talking about. So anyway,
you know what that reminds me of? And I don't know, this may or may not, I've never heard that vignette you just shared, but this is kind of a praxeological thing, right? There's a saying that, no man is better than his incentives. Another way of saying this, how's it been put? It's very difficult for a man to understand a thing that his paycheck depends on him not understanding.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you've got this mathematician coming in saying, hey guys, the whole formality of mathematics has actually just been exploded by your own presuppositions. And it's like, well, everyone that's there is a mathematician. They're like, oh, that doesn't sound good for my career. So let's just ignore that shit.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right, and also he on the on the formal undecidability of blah blah. Like the way he presented, like people were like, what is this guy even talking about? So yeah they didn't realize the far-reaching implications. And on Hoppe, and you're right, and I think it's been a while since I've looked at it, but he is similarly dismissed by a lot of people. They just say like you're right, Mises is not held in the esteem that I think he should be. And Hoppe, especially, like a lot of people hate his guts and think, oh, he's a second-rate philosopher. And one of the things he does in that book, as I recall, or pamphlet, whatever you want to call it, essay, is he kind of goes through and argues that even certain things in math that rely on an infinite number of steps, he says aren't really grounded, whereas stuff that, has a finite. And I remember when I first read that, I was like, oh, come on, you're out of your lane, buddy. But now I'm much more sympathetic to that like to realize, and then going back and historically mathematicians would argue about stuff. So like I said, we have this idea that math is firm and rigorous, whereas there could have been a wrong term in Freudian psychology or in economics. Keynesianism was a waste of time and a cul-de-sac. And I'm just saying it is possible that in math, down the road, eventually they'll say, you know what, when we went down this path and talked about different levels of infinity and stuff, that's kind of weird. Maybe we should, go this other way instead.
Yeah. And that's a great point too, that we often conceive of mathematics as the most, rigorous, scientific. Is it scientific? I don't know if you call mathematics science. I guess it's a scientific discipline because it's based on rationalism. But it too has changed a lot over time, right? It's not just this absolute thing that doesn't change. It's changed as technology has changed. We've invented new mathematics to deal with new things.
One of my highest health priorities is keeping my brain in top shape. To take care of my brain power, I do many things, such as striving to read, write, exercise, and meditate daily. One of the latest tools in my brain power toolkit is MindLab Pro. MindLab Pro is a nootropic supplement that is scientifically proven to enhance your brain power. When I take MindLab Pro, my mind feels like it has a better grip on the world, my thinking is more lucid, and the articulation of my speech is radically improved. MindLab Pro has been tested in rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials and has been proven to enhance brain power for users in every age group. MindLab Pro is an advanced formulation of 11 nootropic ingredients and is backed by research from over 1,400 human trials conducted over the past 32 years. So if you're looking to enhance your brain power, MindLab Pro is an excellent solution. Go to mindlabpro.com/breedlove to start enhancing your brain power today. Again, that's mindlabpro.com/breedlove.
So again, that episode of yours, What Makes Economics Scientific, Human Action Podcast, episode 526. I highly recommend everyone check that out if they haven't heard it. Bob did a great job of unpacking just the nature of praxeology for a lay audience, which is, again, a very important effort in my estimation. And so one of the things, and I'm going to paraphrase you here, and I hope you can unpack it a bit. I think this was a tweet response you made, because you go through a lot of these kind of Twitter arguments you were having. People are saying, hey, economics is bullshit. And you're saying, well, actually this, and using different analogies and metaphors to sort of help people understand what's going on. One of the things you said was, if engineers understood why planes crashed, then there wouldn't be any more plane crashes. Now you're saying this sarcastically, obviously. How, because one of the common criticisms, I guess, of the economics profession is like, oh, well, you guys didn't see the 2008 great financial crisis coming. How can you consider yourself to be economist? You know, like almost if that's a way to just sort of dismiss the whole thing as a science. So yeah, could you just maybe linger on that a bit? It's like, what is the scientific value of economics if it can't predict, certain economic events, financial crises, et cetera? And why is that? The idea of even being able to predict those things is actually kind of nonsensical when you really break it down. So could you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. Great. Okay. So yeah, I do feel for people because I was actually, that was tongue in cheek. I was making fun of economists. I was making fun of mainstream economists when I said that. So let me just unpack the different layers of the onion of my joke there. There's economic content, folks. Don't worry. So yes, after the 2008 crisis, a lot of people were like, what the heck? I think even the Queen of England was like asking, the economic advisors that, in her circles, how come you guys didn't see this coming? Like nobody even told me this was a possibility. What the heck happened? How did you not know this? And, whereas like if some asteroid came and smashed into the earth and ruined it, like people probably would have looked at the physicists and the, astronomers and stuff. How come you guys didn't see this coming? Like, you do no warning. What's going on here? So, and then one of the things that like Nobel laureate economists said in response to her was they tried to like turn that frown upside down. And they said, no. See, in mainstream mathematical economics, we have what's called the efficient markets hypothesis. And it says that stock prices reflect all of publicly available information. And so it can't possibly be that anybody could predict a stock market crash coming, because like if people knew in the year 2007, in the fall, that in 12 months time, the market was going to crash, then what would they do? They would get rid of their stocks. Right. And so that would have pulled the crash forward. And so they're saying like, we've known that anytime there's a stock market crash, it couldn't possibly have been predicted, because otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. Right. Like in other words, if people saw the 2008 crisis coming, it wouldn't have happened in 2008. Okay. And so through that argument, they think they've exonerated us. And I promise folks, I'm not putting words in their mouth. Some of them actually went so far as to say, so the 2008 crisis proves how good our science is, our field is. Like it's like, cherry on the top that shows that we know what we're talking about. Cause we've said for years, if a big crisis is coming, we won't see it coming. So I was making fun of them. And I said like, oh, imagine if a plane crashed, and then people are looking at the engineers and, the air traffic control guys and all these other people. And they said, what the hell? How come you guys didn't catch this? And imagine if the glib engineer said, well, I mean, if you think about it, if we had seen this crash coming, it wouldn't have happened. So that's why we didn't predict it. By definition, if a plane crashes, the people beforehand who got on the plane and took off didn't know it was going to crash. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gotten on the plane. And yeah, that's a true statement, but that doesn't exonerate you guys for not knowing that the plane shouldn't have taken off. You get what I'm saying? And so that's what I was trying to isolate there, was just to show like the smugness and how these guys are complete before, like they're is sophomore, like smart fool. I think that's what the actual term comes from. And like just how sophomoric that is. Like, yeah, they're real sharp and they're good at math and stuff. And they have all these fancy models and the efficient markets hypothesis and blah, blah, blah. But when the thing blows up, and a lot of them don't even like feel any kind of remorse or like, geez, yeah, maybe we should, rethink or something. But some of them were running victory laps and saying, yeah, we told you so, that we wouldn't see something like this coming. And that's why we should get all kinds of funding for our departments. So that's what I was getting at. And so then now, what did the Austrians say? So a couple of things. So one is that, yes, I think when you proceed on a more humble basis, in a wiser course, and you understand what kinds of things can you say with confidence when it comes to the social arena, as opposed to, looking at electrons or something under the microscope, that it's, there's a sense in which, predicting next quarter's GDP, we have no, that's not like trying to predict something in chemistry or something. Like there's too many variables. It's just a fool's errand. But what we can do is talk about, praxeological things. And I will say on this particular example, if people look up Robert Murphy, the worst recession in 25 years, it should pop up at Mises.org in, was it October? Yeah, it was October of 2007. I had a piece saying, I think we're sitting on a big bubble and it's probably going to be the worst recession in 25 years. Okay. So my point being that yes, Austrian economics is not designed to be an empirical, thing spitting out GDP predictions, but I think it does give you qualitative knowledge. Another analogy I've used, I don't remember if I said it in that episode, is imagine, back when they used hydrogen for blimps, and if somebody said, this seems like a bad idea, and then like every time nothing happened, if they said, oh, Chicken Little over here warning that it's going to blow up, and then the Hindenburg happens, then I was like, oh yeah, we probably shouldn't be doing that. Yeah. And so likewise here, yes, it's, when I wrote that article, it wasn't that I knew that, yes, first Bear Stearns is going to go down and then Lehman's going to go down and it's going to happen exactly at this time. And the S&P 500 is going to fall by such, but I just knew qualitatively based on, studying Mises, that I thought what the Fed had done had blown up a bubble in the housing sector. Okay. So, and that, this is an unstable situation. Okay. So that's the kind of thing where, right, that I think, solid, let me put it this way. The whole point of the mathematical economists who try to ape the methods of the physicists is they're saying we're being rigorous because we make testable implications and blah, blah. And then when their whole enterprise blows up in their face, for them to kind of retreat to this weird thing where, like we're saying we couldn't have predicted that. It's like, well, you're trying to have it both ways. Which is it?
Yeah, right.
Are you guys right because your theories match prediction better than your rivals? Because that's the criterion you're holding up, and then you can't hide behind, efficient markets. How could we possibly have known? Right. So that's kind of goofy in and of itself. And so I'm saying when you realize, okay, if the Austrians are right and you can make true statements about human activity or action in the economic arena, but it's not the kind that the typical Keynesian makes about, here's my forecast for demand or GDP growth and blah, blah, blah. Then I think, that gives you qualitative knowledge that makes you wiser and more alert to possible dangers, even though you might not be able to quantify it and give an exact timetable on when that thing is going to hit.
Right. This is the distinction between theory and data, I think, right? The example I like to cite here is Copernicus, right? That we all observed the same data for many centuries before Copernicus, right? The sun rises, the sun sets, sun rises, sun sets. So obviously the sun's going around the earth, right? Geocentrism all the way. And then along comes Copernicus with some very rigorous mathematics and says, actually, all of your data has it exactly backwards, right? It's the earth that's going around the sun. It's heliocentric rather than geocentric. And so the theory is like the interpretive lens through which we understand the data, something like that. And that's what economics is giving us, right? It's like, well, you see the 2008 great financial crisis. It's like, well, if you interpret that through the lens of praxeology and, the Austrian business cycle theory, that makes sense, right? They blew a giant credit bubble up in the housing market and then that bubble popped. But it doesn't give you the specific, this theory is going to tell you the exact date this is going to happen, which companies are going to collapse first, which sectors like that. That's not doable or possible, but the interpretive schema is still very useful. Does that analogy land?
I think it's right insofar as it goes. It might be a bit misleading in the sense that with Copernicus versus the, geocentric modelers, they kind of were using the same raw facts and they were just having different frames for interpreting them. Whereas I think, with like Austrian economists versus mainstream ones, it's not that they disagree on what the certain facts are, but the Austrians, I think, worry about certain things, specifically like what the Austrians have in mind in terms of like what function do prices serve, and like why is it important that the interest rate actually be the correct one and not artificially pushed down by the central bank or the banking system. Like those questions don't really work in a mathematical mainstream model because they kind of assumed away all that stuff. They just focused on equilibrium.
Yeah.
Here's how you quote solve the model. So like all the work that market prices serve in the Austrian framework is assumed away in the mainstream model. So it's not like I guess that's the only problem possibly with your analogy is it's not merely that they agree just on the set of facts and one story says one thing and one story says something else. It's that the kind of facts that the Austrians worry about, they like include processes and things that mainstreamers don't even think about. They just kind of take that for granted.
Yeah. Yeah. Could we say that mainstream economics is overly formalized? Again, you talked about like kind of the physics envy earlier that it had. It was trying to overly mathematize these things, whereas the Austrians are much more humble in their approach.
I think that's true, but it's ironic because you alluded to Eric Weinstein a minute ago. So just to clarify, I've been doing a lot, like having him as a guest on a podcast, and I've been doing a lot of follow-up posts and things on his framework to bring what he calls gauge, or what is called gauge theory, and apply it to mathematical econ. Mm-hmm. So it's not that I think that what he's doing is better than praxeology, but it's the kind of thing where actual mathematicians looking at mathematical economics as it unfolded over the last 50 years are like, this is extremely crude. Like, what do you guys do? Like, given that you're going to use math to try to model economic activity, why don't you do it this way? You know what I mean? And then there's lots of people like Nassim Taleb, the Black Swan guy. He has a similar take as well. He uses a lot of stuff when he's trading options and stuff, so he's not afraid to use math when it comes to financial markets. And it's just the models that mainstream economists use are ridiculously crude. Okay, just so your listeners know, Robert. So I went to NYU from 98 to 03 to get my PhD, and at the time NYU was like, I don't know, top 15 program in the world. So it was it was a good program, and like in the first year, we're sitting there learning the macro models, and the baseline model was, there's one household who we assumed lives forever. And that you know what I mean? Like there were no, like it wasn't that they traded, it was just, and there was one firm with one production function. And like that was the thing. We spent a lot of time just studying that model. And I'm just saying, like, and it just dawned on me, and there was no money. Why would there be? Like, you don't need money in a model. And it just dawned on me, like, holy cow, if the public understood that this is, what the first year PhD students are learning at a top 15 economics program, I think they would be kind of horrified. And so, and it's not because the people were dumb. It was just the economy is so complicated. It's hard, once you start making the model more sophisticated, anything can happen. So that's partly why they, you can't quote solve it. It's too open-ended, right? So anyway, I'm not making fun of it. I understand why that happened, but the point is that should have been a clue. I'm coming back to your question about, is it too formalized? My concern is I think it gives the appearance of a solid foundation and rigor, when it's like, no, you guys made a bunch of simplifying assumptions and this isn't true. There's all kinds of things that your model's leaving out, but yet it's got the nice bells and whistles and it looks real fancy. And, so anyway, I think that's the problem, is that yes, it's actually pretty crude in terms of people who really know high level math, but it's dangerous in that it gives the appearance of rigor when it's not really there.
Yes, I think it encourages people to be more likely to mistake map for territory. Like they start to take the model as reality rather than reality as reality. And that's always problematic.
Yeah. Can I give you my just real quick on that, Robert? My favorite example of that was, and this guy's not, nice guy, very open-minded and stuff, not like trying to make fun of him or something, but just, so I was going through the program and this guy was teaching some stuff and he was showing this problem that was, out there in the literature of, I forget what they called it, like the convergence gap or something. But the deal was like, okay, we got the USSR and they've got their production function and the US has got their production function, that takes capital and labor and turns it into output. Okay. And there seemed to be this big gap, like empirically. Like how come, per capita output is so much higher in the US than in the Soviet Union, based on historical data. And he was saying, it can't be that the production function's different because, all the Soviet engineers can go to the top universities abroad. And so, so they know the recipes for how do you turn inputs into outputs. So it can't be that. And he was going through possible, maybe it's because the thing is concave and blah, blah, blah. And nowhere did anybody in the class, him or anyone in the class, say, maybe because they were communist? It didn't even come up. And at first I thought like, oh, we all know that's the reason, right? But we're trying to do it in the math. And then no, and I talked to him after that. It wasn't that they all knew that was the answer. Like it didn't even. So that's like was very eye-opening to me, because I thought we were all kind of doing the math as like, putting on a show, but behind the scenes we knew what the real stuff was. And I realized, no, these people haven't read Thomas Sowell. They haven't read Walter Williams or Henry Hazlitt. A lot of these guys, were like good at math. Like some of them coming to NYU just had undergrad math majors. Like they didn't even study.
Yeah.
Like, so no, they were not reading, what classics in the Austrian tradition for sure. Or even just, stuff like economics in one lesson.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. And maybe another way to put it, right? Mistaking map for territory is you start to overemphasize the quantitative and underemphasize or ignore the qualitative.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, in reality, the qualitative is pretty damn important, right? You got to know again, where you're coming from, or, the context and the circumstances, which you would get from, either studying praxeology or reading some of the books you just mentioned, Hazlitt, Sowell, et cetera. There are some fundamental qualitative issues in the Soviet Union that cause its, quote unquote economy to eventually become a diseconomy, right? Where they're actually the outputs are less than the inputs at some point because, well, they don't have price discovery. They don't, all of the reasons that by which Mises destroyed socialism, right? The economic calculation problem, all of those things were at play. And so that thing obviously doesn't work. And I think, I don't know if Mises predicted this, but he did say the Soviet Union would fail at some point, right? And everyone's like, yeah, right. Things ripping and roaring, proof that communism is superior. And then at some point, boom, it just goes bankrupt almost overnight.
Yeah. So I don't know if he ever made a formal prediction. What I will say is, I think we alluded to earlier in this talk about, there's a recording of him in his language, and his accent was really thick. But in that talk, so again, the title of the talk that he gave, I think it was in the 60s, was Why Socialism Always Fails. And he's going through what is called the socialist calculation argument. And so he's just saying, logically speaking, like you can kind of deduce it that, in his work, he showed that market prices give this indispensable framework for accountants. Right. That, like in order for you to say a given business, is it profitable or not? There's institutional prerequisites. You need to have private property because they have to be able to, look at the prices for their inputs and compare them to their revenue and see, are we profitable or not? And that really, quote, means something. It's not just arbitrary. Okay. So that is lacking in a genuine, top-down, centrally planned economy. They can have what they call prices and tell managers trade as if these were the real, but that's all just giving them orders and stuff. It's not real. And so he was going through that. And then a guy in the Q&A said something like, can the Soviet Union survive without using prices from the West? And so I think the guy was just lobbing Mises a softball, because I know Mises has written elsewhere that if one country goes socialist, the problems I'm talking about, me Ludwig von Mises I'm talking about here, they could grope by because they could just get like newspapers and see what are the prices of the various commodities and stuff in the capitalist countries abroad to give them some idea of the trade-offs, right? So they would know what's the relative valuation of these inputs, so we can kind of guide ourselves. And he said, whereas if the communists achieve their actual goal of worldwide, workers' revolt and genuine, one global communist system, then he said you'd really see the implications, because then there would be no genuine market prices anywhere. So I think that's what the guy in the crowd was just lobbing him a softball, but Mises didn't take it that way. He said something like, what does it mean for a country, the Soviets to survive? So I know what it means for a man to survive. And he said, but what does it mean for them to survive? And he said, there is, socialism in the Soviet Union right now. It's there, but I forget it. His point was, yeah, the regime exists. I'm not saying socialism is impossible, meaning there can't be a socialist system, but he was saying from day one, they can't engage in economic calculation. So he was trying to isolate, like, here's what I'm saying is from the outset, they're groping in the dark. Now it's an empirical thing. How long can they do that? How long will the people tolerate their living standards? That's a separate issue. So anyway, that was to me interesting that that's how he handled it. He didn't say to the guy, he wasn't like looking at his watch saying, yeah, I think they're on their last legs. Like,
Right.
I think he was kind of just isolating. I'm saying from day one, they couldn't engage in economic calculation. And so they're just groping in the dark.
Yeah. Again, it's a qualitative thing, right? It's like, this is not a sustainable model. This is going to fail at some point. He's not saying on October 19th, 1989 or whatever, it's going to collapse. Okay. Where should we go here? You gave this other example, and I don't know, maybe you want to grab onto this one. If not, we could take it whatever direction you like. But you had mentioned in that podcast episode the analogy with seismology, right? The study of earthquakes. That, obviously that's a real empirical science, but its failure to predict any particular earthquake does not invalidate it as a science. And so I guess we keep coming back to this kind of core issue that people tend to overestimate the ability of science to predict things, which is really, it seems to be, science really seems to struggle with prediction outside of like very pure physics or pure mathematics. Like once you get into the, whatever it is, you could be a cardiologist. It's not going to be like, oh, you're going to have a heart attack on February 18th, 2000. Right. It's like, that's not how cardiology works, right? They're studying patterns and probabilities and things and, helping you kind of manage your lifestyle in a way that you can lower the chances of you having a cardiac event. That doesn't mean they're going to predict precisely when it's going to happen, which is obviously different than, hey, if I throw a softball at 10 meters per second, this direction at this parabola, it's going to land here at that time. That's a much more precise process. So is that the core theme? Is like, we just need to get a little more humility in our appreciation of the predictive power of certain sciences? Okay.
So great question. So I think one thing is, right, when you try to isolate it and say, what's the issue? Like, why is it that the quote scientific method, by which we mean the story we probably learned in school about scientists make hypothesis and then they go get testable implications and go gather data and run experiment, that story really only works in a certain limited area where you can do reproducible experiments, right? And in that realm, there really aren't schools of thought if the experiments can be conducted. Like there's one group of physicists that think, if you run that experiment, this is going to happen. Another group says, no, this is going to happen. You go run the experiment and, you can do it a few times to make sure you set it up right. But if it's consistently the one group is right and the other one's wrong, then people are going to say, okay, the falsified group, clearly they're wrong. And the other ones tentatively will say they're right until we, maybe come up with finer conditions and maybe tease out the exact, laws of nature. But there's really not many areas where you can do that. Okay. And so like in the social sciences, that's partly why we're still arguing over the Great Depression. Paul Krugman, we rely on facts, but the point is really what we would have to do, because I'm saying, if Herbert Hoover hadn't told businesses to keep their wage rates high, which he did, then yes, prices collapsed, but wage rates would have come down. And so I don't think unemployment would have gone up to 25%. That's why in the 20 and 21 depression, in a 1 year span, a 12-month span, prices came down faster than they did in any 12-month span in the 30s. And yet, that the 20s were the roaring 20s. We don't associate the 20s with this awful economy, right? So, and it's because wages were flexible back then. But technically, I don't know that, right? Like to do it, you'd have to have a time machine and run the clock.
Right.
And then have the 29 stock market crash, and then have Herbert Hoover tell everybody, laissez-faire for the win, baby. And he would like have to be the Herbert Hoover that we were taught he was, because he wasn't. Okay, so that's one thing. And, in Krugman and those guys, they say, yeah, they did big pump priming and whatever, but it just wasn't enough. If they had just done more deficit spending, then it would have worked. Right. And so, because I can just point and say they did deficit spending and it was terrible. So that's the thing, is we don't have a controlled experiment. And so then that's what people were saying was the seismology example, when people were asking the economists after the 2008 crash, how come you guys didn't see this coming? And so some of them, one guy had a mainstream economist on my show, and, I wasn't arguing, I was just letting him talk. And that's one of the defenses he gave for, his discipline, because he's a mathematical economist, was to say, if there's an earthquake, nobody gets mad at the seismologist and says their field is is bankrupt. But so later in the episode you're talking about now, Robert, I pushed back on that because I was going to say, right, if like nobody got mad at economists for not predicting the high unemployment due to the lockdowns of COVID, right? Like how could an economist 3 years earlier, unless he'd been talking to Bill Gates, am I right? How could he have possibly seen that coming, right? And so nobody would blame him for that. But the 2008 crisis, there were plenty of economists, including me. Mark Thornton, wrote all kinds of stuff on this. You can go listen to Peter Schiff or whatever, the talks he was given, the interviews he was given on CNBC before that happened. There were lots of economists warning this kind of thing is germinating, is going to happen. And so the point is, there's a sense in which the 2008 crisis is the fault of the financial system, and had the economists done a better job giving guidance to policymakers and whatever, presumably that wouldn't have happened, right? So as opposed to an earthquake, I mean, I know some people say fracking can cause earthquake, but in general, you think earthquakes are kind of like an act of nature, not something that's because of the way humans have been interacting with plate tectonics. So that's, I think, an important difference there in the sense in which economists can exonerate themselves for the '08 crisis, because in my view, the reason that happened is because it was a system given to us under the design and guidance of Keynesian mathematical economists.
Yeah, it seems to be like our interfacing with complex adaptive systems is just an area where we need to be very, very humble and not overestimate our abilities so much. So this is one frame I've tried to put around it. I don't know. You'll have to let me know what you think about it. But this idea that psychology is private economics and economics is public psychology. So what I mean by that is, well, we've already talked about the axiom of action and how you ascertain that through self-reflection, right? That, oh yes, I am a goal-directed actor. I'm always, choosing one path of goal-directed action at the exclusion of all others. I'm using scarce means to try and achieve my goal, right? Time, energy, attention, money, whatever the scarce thing is, I'm expending that trying to get toward my goal. And so a lot of our psychology, perhaps all of it, is centered around that economic, the core economic axiom, the axiom of action. And then economics, as we broadly, let's talk about like economic history here rather than economic science per se, is kind of like a theater of public psychology, right? Like it's a bunch of people's paths of goal-directed action and perspectives and opinions and all these things kind of getting mashed together into the market process and price discovery and all of the things that go into the market process. And, moving the world basically. And so there's a deep relationship between psychology and economics, I guess is what I'm driving towards here. And to give like a more concrete example, the idea of inflation, right? So inflation meaning the loss of purchasing power specifically here. So, the actual, let's just focus on the dollar. Let's say, I'm not going to say, obviously there's monetary inflation that causes price inflation. So I'm focused a little bit more on the monetary piece here. You increase the number of dollars in circulation, the purchasing power of each dollar goes down. Okay, well, that in and of itself is a deeply psychological process, because if everyone just expected the purchasing power of the dollar to decline in the future, well, then their response would be to sell their dollars for something else, which would then create the decline in purchasing power that they were anticipating. Right? Just like you said earlier about like, oh, if everyone knew the economy was going to crash in whatever month it was, September 2008, well, then everyone would have just sold their stocks, a month to 6 months prior, and then it would have just pulled that crash forward. And so again, there's a deep connection to human psychology here. And if you just, any human that's ever interacted with another human for more than 2 seconds, that humans are inherently unpredictable, right? There's not anything, like, oh, every time I say this word to my wife, she does this thing. It's like, well, that's just not the case. What in the world makes you think 8.5 billion psychologies interacting in this complex market process would somehow be more predictable than one psychology.
Right, right.
And so I don't know, is that a useful framing? Like we're just talking about like the complex system that is the human psychology, but then scaled up to 8.5 billion people. And so we need to have a lot of humility as it relates to that. And then, you know, as praxeology plays into this, like there's a very few things that we know that we can know.
Right.
And then we can use that to interpret this kind of infinitude of data that we get from economic history.
So there's a very special place called the farm at Okefenokee. It's a 1,000-acre regenerative farm community about 45 minutes northwest of Jacksonville, Florida. The farm is a completely off-grid community. It has total food, water, and energy independence. Everything on the farm is 100% organic, and it even features wild boar and bear hunting. The farm at Okefenokee is right next to the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, where you can do camping and canoeing tours. So if you're like me and you're interested in the self-sovereign lifestyle, then you can get your own lot on the farm at Okefenokee if you tell them that I sent you. Once you get a lot, you can build one of 3 custom cabin options. So if you value freedom, self-sovereignty, and living in touch with nature, then join me and my family. We have lot number 21, and we're going to be building a cabin there starting December 2025. To learn more about the farm at Okefenokee, go to okefarm.com and make sure to tell them that I sent you.
Okay. Yeah. So a lot there. Let me take a minute to just give people a little bit more than the action axiom. Because again, this was something that was spelled out in Hoppe's ESAM, Economic Science, the Austrian Method, that I did not fully appreciate. I think his essay was the first place I'd seen this spelled out. And then once I saw that, I was like, oh yeah. And what I'm trying to do here is to distinguish it from mere psychology, like to show that, no, there really is a logic to it. And by the way, I don't think we said praxeology means like the logic of action, like like the Greek word praxis, I think means action. Yep. And so that's, you know, eology, just like any kind of logy means the study of, the rigorous study of. Okay. So you say, okay, what can you do besides action? What flows from that? Like I understand Pythagorean theorem flows from the axioms of geometry. So you can deduce things like every choice has an opportunity cost, right? And if you just think through that, if I'm going to analyze something as an example of human action, then there is an ego at work that has preferences, right? That it has some goal in mind. Like some states of the world are better than others, and that's why this being is acting, because it wants to, in some sense, divert the course of history, if you want to talk like that. And so what that means then, that from that choosing agent's point of view, it's going to steer events one way versus another. And so to do it, we presume it's doing the thing, you know, that it prefers, but necessarily there must be some best thing that it has given up by that choice that it can now no longer achieve. Right? In other words, if it could just satisfy everything without having to sacrifice, then there would be a sense in which it wasn't really acting, right? It was just kind of just like it is. Like it just, you know, you're at one with the universe and nirvana. But the fact that you had to make a decision and choose means you picked one thing at the expense of something else. And so what do we mean by opportunity cost is the subjective value that choosing agent put on the next best thing that no longer is attainable. So my point is, that's not an empirical, that's not an a posteriori thing, but it also doesn't seem like it's just flowing from the action axiom per se. That seems like I'm saying a lot more about reality than just people act, to say every choice has an opportunity cost. And yet you can see how I deduced it, assuming that you agree with my logic. And then just one last one, like the notion of diminishing marginal utility. When I define for you, what do I mean by those terms? And then I can give you the argument. And it's logical just to say, if I keep giving more units of a good or a service to somebody, he keeps devoting it to less and less important ends. And how do we know? It's not that we go empirically measure that. It's just like by nature, by its very structure, given that the person's goal seeking and wants to achieve certain goals, of course, he's going to satisfy the most important things first. And you say, well, how do you know? You say, because if he didn't, then the things he is satisfying would be the most important. That's what it means to say the most important. You know what I mean? Like, it's not that you could ever find an example of someone acting against his own perceived interest.
Right.
You know what I mean? So, okay. So those, I'm just giving it a flavor of that's the kind of stuff Hoppe means when he's saying economic law is more like geometry than it is like physics or chemistry. That you're not going out and doing experiments and getting feedback on how do people behave in the real world. It's like, no, you're thinking through the logical consequences of this. And then the claim is you can actually build all those chains of reasoning up and start getting an idea of, well, you know, like one last one. Two people engage in a voluntary trade. Both of them walk away with the item that they think is more valuable.
Yeah.
If it was a voluntary trade, you know, so stuff like that. So that right there shows Aristotle is wrong. It's not that objects traded have equal value. No, why would you trade them? That's the point, right? So anyway, lots of things like that. And you can build stuff up step by step. So that's not psychology per se, but on the other hand, it is like mental, right? It's like linking the mind about, and Frank Fetter, who is one, he's often considered like either literally an Austrian or like he's so close that we consider him part of us. But technically he thought he was part of what's called the psychological school. And that's why they embrace that term. So Fetter was like late 1800s, early 1900s. He was really big on capital and interest theory, but that's why they use that, because they were trying to distinguish themselves from like the crude materialist, like David Ricardo was real like nuts and bolts, and there's farmland and we're producing stuff, and even they were kind of like labor powers making things. Whereas, you know, in the wake of the subjectivist marginal revolution, people realize no, economic stuff, it's like in your mind, and you know, how you value something, like that's ultimately it's in your mind. And like, why do certain items trade for such, and in the financial sector in particular, like you're talking about earlier, that's clearly just all kinds of like expectations and things like that. Like, it's not just which of these companies do I think has the best fundamentals, but which company do I think everybody else is going to think has the best fundamentals? You know what I mean? And that's like, it's what's called Keynes's beauty contest. And last thing I'll say, Robert, is that's why there's a lot in Keynes. Like if you read his 1936, general theory, he has a lot of passages in there where it's some interesting stuff. So when I say like, I'm not a Keynesian, I mean like how some of his disciples took that stuff and turned it into government policy prescriptions. But a lot of his thoughts on like how open-ended the markets are and stuff, like this guy Shackle was really into that. There are, people who look back upon that, and I think some of that stuff is worthwhile. Like he actually was putting his finger on this kind of very narrow mathematical equilibrium treatment. Like last thing I'll say is it's interesting in the stock market. It's almost like to explain a trade, there have to be people have different expectations of the future.
Right.
Like a guy getting rid of a stock to somebody else. I mean, maybe you need liquidity or something, but in general, it's like, oh, the bears are selling to the bulls because they have different forecasts. So like this idea that we could just all be in general equilibrium and everybody agrees on everything, it's kind of like, well, then there'd be no point of the stock market. Yeah.
No, that's a great point too, that dynamism requires disequilibrium, right? Like for the market to be in process,
right,
presupposes there's all these equilibria, I guess, between buyers and sellers and lenders and borrowers and all these things. And that's how we sort it out, right? That's the public psychology component. It's like, and also why the market knows more than you, right? It's because it's got all of this data compressed into it that no individual mind presumably can contain.
Yeah. So just real quick. So that's why, earlier when I was saying that the Austrians, like our approach, like we can know when something is probably not, something dangerous is afoot, is because we understand like, oh, so what role does the stock market play? Like market prices, what do they do? What is it? And I'm saying in certain mainstream mathematical models, there's no need for a stock market because everybody has all the information anyway. And you already have equilibrium. We've already reached a general intertemporal equilibrium. And so what do you mean that the Fed has artificially, so in a typical Keynesian framework, to say that, oh, do you think the Fed has too loose of a policy just means, oh, price inflation is going to be worse than is optimal. But it doesn't mean they could cause a boom bust cycle because what are you talking about? So it's not that they don't predict it. It's like in their model that literally can't happen.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I was just reminded too, Mises has that thought experiment of the evenly rotating economy. I think it's in Human Action.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just saying like, yeah, if that, which is basically the economy where everyone has perfect information, he's like, so in that world, in that obviously hypothetical world, like no one in the real world knows everything clearly, you wouldn't even need money, right? Money wouldn't even exist because you would just match all of the maturity. Every time your obligations came due, you would just have already matched that to whatever needed to be traded to offset. And so, yeah, it's interesting. Again, I think the Austrians were like one of the first schools to really start to contend with complex adaptive systems. And only more recently have we even developed the language to say things like complex adaptive systems, right? This is the past, I don't know, 100 to 150 years, maybe chaos theory and all these other things have given us this jargon to deal with it. But the Austrians were onto it much earlier, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and this kind of dovetails what we were saying earlier. So yes, back, let's say in the early 1900s, when certain economists wanted to take economics down this path of, formal mathematical models and general equilibrium frameworks and blah, blah, blah. And people like Mises and, his disciples rebelled against that. They did it for methodological reasons, but then you're right that later on with the rise of, chaos theory and, Mandelbrot and these guys and modeling thing, that the math eventually allowed for a better way of studying those chaotic systems and things like that. And so that's a sense in which they, like an Eric Weinstein or somebody now, can circle back and say, well, geez, if you're going to try to use math in the financial sector, at least use these tools. What are you guys doing? You know what I mean? They're using the kindergarten stuff. So that's kind of what, what's going on, like different ways of dealing with the fact that, yes, the humans are, like you say, like any individual person's kind of unpredictable in some fundamental sense. Like again, the difference between the rock and the, and the pilot flying the plane is there is a sense in which the rock's behavior is determined. I mean, you can get down on the quantum mechanical level and stuff, but I mean, at our scale, you throw on the rock, yeah, that's pretty much determined. Whereas the human, notice, we can ex post explain what happened. The plane goes up and then comes down, and we can have theories, and you can go and check and see, oh yeah, it turned out a passenger had food poisoning and that's why they turned around or whatever. Or he realized that they didn't have enough gas or, jet fuel, whatever. But, at time zero, you can't predict that that's what's going to happen. And yet would you say, oh, well, if you can't predict it the way you can with the rock, then that means you should use that. And like, we should really try to get into the nervous system, because really that's where it seems that all the action's happening, no pun intended. If we could just get the exact position of all the neurons at time zero in the pilot's nervous system, then probably we could figure out, but you can just realize that'd be hopeless, right? At least, so maybe neuroscientists 500 years from now will say, no, actually we got a handle on that. And okay. But for right now, and that's kind of the approach Mises takes in Human Action philosophically. Like he acknowledges, he says it might be in the future, we do understand why people do the things they do. But for right now, there's this chasm, and we can just say it's their action, and there's this methodological divide. And some things in our world seem due to the mechanical laws of nature, and other things seem due to free will. And maybe free will is an illusion, but for right now, we got to act as if it is true.
Yeah. And again, I think Godel would say we're probably never going to get there, right? You're not going to get it in a formal system, at least. I don't know. You might get better heuristics or something, but
yeah. I mean, so I personally think that, because I follow like the intelligent design movement. So I think that, as we learn more about, like, even at the cellular level, it's crazy the stuff that, things are doing. And so, I don't think we're going to sweep teleology and intentionality and stuff out of the system and say, oh, it turns out everything really is just atoms bouncing around like billiard balls. I don't think that's ever coming back. But I'm saying Mises was humble enough. He wasn't laying down the law forever. He was just saying, right now, you want to talk about the way an economy works. I'm telling you, you got to assume people act and go this way. You're going to get a lot farther than if you try to treat them as if they're molecules.
Yeah. And man, it's interesting. Back to the map territory metaphor, you always have to leave that possibility open to some extent, right? That, reason needs to be able to disrupt itself and improve itself over time for it to be reasonable, I guess.
Right.
All right. So we've drifted back maybe into the philosophical esoteric a bit, but this is really what I'm honestly interested in a lot. So I want to ask you about this. Clearly the subjective theory of value, right? That so value is an ordinal preference, right? People have preferences and they express those preferences through action. This is the theory that, won out, I guess, over what Marx's labor theory of value, that somehow the amount of labor that went into producing a thing was determinant of its value or its, price in the marketplace. But so there's this obvious subjective element to the process of valuation, in that we all have our own preferences. We all choose what we're going to do, and we choose means appropriate to pursue ends. And that's all a subjective thing. But there's one thing I don't see discussed enough, and it's very core to praxeology, is what I call there's an objective aspect too, right? Which is, and I'm subject object. I don't know. We can get into more of that. I think action is, again, sort of pre that split. So that's probably why it has a subjective and an objective aspect here. The subjective aspect being, hey, we all have preferences. We choose means to pursue ends, et cetera. But then there's this objective aspect in that we always prefer, all else being equal, present satisfaction to later satisfaction, right? I'd rather solve a problem now than solve the same problem in the same way later, because of scarcity, basically, right? That, it's, I may not be alive tomorrow. I don't want to spend more time, attention, energy, other scarce resources solving a problem that I have to, because I have to economize my means. And so is that fair to say that even in Mises's subjective, well, let's just say in the subjective theory of value, that there is an objective component? Because that's where we get time preference, right? That people prefer present satisfaction to later satisfaction. And then what they need to give up, an apple today is worth the same as an apple tomorrow. It's like, well, not really. You need to give me an apple plus 2% tomorrow for me to actually do that trade. Is that an objective component of the process of valuation?
Okay, so I'm in a bit of an awkward position, because in my dissertation, I actually challenged the pure time preference theory of interest. Okay. So I can certainly, say things from Mises' perspective for sure, and say what the canonical.
Feel free to challenge it too. I mean, I'm just just where my mind is taking me. I want to just
So for people, listeners to know exactly what you're referring to, right? That Mises says, when it comes to explaining the phenomenon of interest, how is it that capitalists who seem to have, that have a financial sum of capital, it seems like in a market economy, it's pretty regular occurrence that they can earn a return on that, even though they're not working or they're not, using land or something. How is it that happens? And going back to Bombaverk in the Austrian tradition, we say, that has to do with present goods being more valuable than future goods. That's the reason. It's not because capital is physically productive. That's already, included in the price of the tractor or whatever. But the reason you can spend $10,000 buying, or whatever, $100,000 buying a brand new tractor, and then over time rent it out to farmers and then get back more than $100,000 during the course of its life, that's because present goods are more valuable than future goods. That you're, in a sense, trading that, you're transforming your present purchasing power into future. And because you're willing to make that trade, that's why you end up with more stuff. Okay. So that's kind of the idea. And so Mises wanted to put that on an a priori foundation. And he wanted to say this notion of preferring things, satisfaction sooner rather than later. That's not just an empirical regularity. And it's not just because, your life is finite or whatever. He wanted to make it that action per se requires that feature or characteristic. And so, and his arguments, look, one was pretty straightforward, to just say, if you're, an acting being and you want to achieve an end, can we say anything about when it happens? And Mises thought, clearly, other things equal, you'd want it to happen sooner rather than later, because if you didn't care, if you were actually indifferent whether it happened today or a year from now, Okay, so then it happened. You said, do you want it to happen today or a year from now? I don't care. Okay, then we let a year pass.
Right.
And now at that moment, you say again, do you want it to happen now or a year from now? And if
Defer
you don't
forever.
care.
Yeah.
And so Mises was saying, if you didn't have that inbuilt preference for it to be sooner rather than later, then that would be equivalent to saying you actually didn't value it.
Mhm,
Okay. So
mhm.
anyway, that was it. People can take it or leave it. Like I said, I had some issues with that, but that's the framework. And so now you're saying, is that not merely a subjective analysis?
Yeah, I guess I was asking if there is a component to the process of valuation that's not purely subjective. But I wasn't aware actually that you wrote this piece or challenged it. So I mean, I don't know. We're just wanting to hear your thoughts on it. If you want to present the challenge, that would be great too. It leads into something else where I think, back to Hoppe's quote that it's only through action that mind and reality come into contact.
Mm-hmm.
I've started to look at action as like the unity from which subject object duality comes from, that it's something more, it's ontologically prior basically to the subject object split. And so that's why value is, what does Mises say? That all value is expressed through action. Mm-hmm. So I was just curious about the process of valuation. Maybe it has a subjective and an objective component.
Well, I can talk about this for sure. I don't know if this is touching on or is an example of the kind of thing you mean, but definitely, like you could say action comes first, and then that's where we get like a means end framework from. Mm-hmm. And so you can say things like, oh yeah, the reason that the vineyard has value is because people like to drink wine. People get subjective utility or satisfaction from drinking wine. And then people know, like their understanding of how the world works empirically, that, how do you make wine? You got to use grapes. And so, and this land over here is very good for growing these kind of grapes that are suitable for wine that people like a lot. And so even though physically what happens mechanically in terms of cause and effect is people plant the stuff, the grapes grow, you take that, you squash them, you put them into wine bottles and sell them to people. So it looked like time flows that way. But in terms of explaining market prices and valuation, it's, the first thing we need to know is that people like wine. And then that lets us go backwards and say, we make guesses about how much they'd be willing to pay for these bottles. And then that, allows the farmers to make guesses as to what do I want to plant? And like, how much, is this land worth? So, whereas that was like opposite, like you were saying, the old classical approach kind of viewed it as the value was in the factors of production, and that kind of flowed into the consumer goods. And so this kind of flipped it, that no, actually you start, the primitive thing is subjective valuation from consumers to the final items. And then you kind of work backwards to attribute the value of the ends to the means. Right. Like, so like Crusoe's walking around his island and he sees a really good stick and he's like, I could use that to knock down coconuts. And so he's really he really values it. Like Friday sees the same stick and they fight over it. And he's like, why do you care so much about a stick? Well, you can't eat a stick. What are you going to do? And he's like, no, but I can knock down coconut. So it's like the value of the coconuts he's mentally attributing to the stick.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Almost like a discounted future cash flow thing.
Oh yeah. Right.
Backing into it. Yeah. Okay. That's all well and good. I'll just I guess just the process of actually rank ordering your preferences and then acting, you're peeling off the top, basically always doing the thing that you rank highest. Mm-hmm. That is an objective aspect of valuations. Like we're all at least doing that. When I say objective, I'm not sure this is the right word, but it's the thing that it's the thing that doesn't change basically. Is that we're all rank ordering our preferences and then acting accordingly. What those actual preferences are, of course, is totally subjective, and you can change it and move it around and all that. Mm-hmm. Would that be correct to say?
Yeah, if I understand what you mean by that, yeah, I think that sounds right. And again, just for people to understand, so the idea is, because you said the ordinal thing before, and make sure people know what you mean.
Yeah.
The idea,
First, second, third, first.
Yeah. So ordinal numbers, for people is like first, second, seventh, things like that. Whereas cardinal is the other type of number. That's just what you think of as regular numbers, like 1, 7, 8.247. And so the way I like to motivate is it makes sense. You could rank your friends. Like you could say, oh yeah, Jim's my best friend, Sally's my second best friend. You could, that would make sense. But it's not that if someone said, well, why do you say that? It's, oh, because Jim has 1,300 friendship units and Sally has 842. And you wouldn't say that your second best friend has twice as many friendship units as your fourth best. It's not that it's wrong. It's like, it doesn't even make sense to talk like that.
Right.
And so likewise in the Austrian framework, they're really fastidious about when you choose items, it's always a discrete choice. And so it makes sense to rank things. And that's where what I call diminishing marginal utility comes in, that you could say like, oh, the first unit of water is very valuable to you, whereas the second and third ones, it's not as much. And so that's how you explain stuff like how come diamonds on the market have a higher value than water, because we have so much water, that kind of stuff. But ultimately it's all ordinal rankings, and that's how you can explain consumer behavior. And whereas, mathematical economists talk about utility functions and things that, spit out cardinal numbers. And so that's one of the divides that, Austrians are pretty finicky about, and to say, no, make sure you don't think utility is not this substance that you could measure in principle. Just like friendship, you can rank your friends. That kind of makes sense, but it's not, because again, you assign this cardinal value of friendship that is in principle measurable.
Yes. Okay.
Or you don't need to assume that. Like some people might have a model of the world where that's what they do, but I'm saying it's perfectly coherent to say I have my best friend without meaning you think there's such a thing as a quantitative amount of friendship units that you attribute to people.
Yes, that all makes sense. Okay, it is time. I promised to get you out here by 3:30, so I will do that. Bob, this was awesome. I love talking to you about this topic. I mean, praxeology is infinitely interesting. Anyone that hasn't studied it should study it. I think your book choice is a great starting point, great intro to Mises and his work and the work of the other Austrians. If you have any closing words of wisdom, please feel free to share. Otherwise, could you please let people know where they can find you on the internet?
Okay, sure. So I would, if people like what we talked about, then Hoppe's essay is really good. Again, it's economic science and the Austrian method. You could get the free PDF. You just Google his name, Hoppe, is how you spell Hoppe. And where to find me at Twitter, I'm Bob Murphy Econ. I host a Human Action podcast. If you just Google, Bob Murphy Human Action Podcast, you'll find it. And also, if you're interested in more financial sector stuff, I'm also the chief economist over at Infinio. So if you go to infinio.ai, you can see what we're doing there with blockchain finance and stuff like that.
Awesome. Bob, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Robert.
We lock our doors, we encrypt our hard drives, and we use strong passwords. But most people leave one thing wide open: their phone line. SIM swap attacks are one of the fastest growing methods of digital theft. In minutes, a hacker can clone your accounts, reset your passwords, and drain your life. Unfortunately, this is not science fiction. It happens every single day. Efani is the only mobile service protection designed exclusively to protect you from SIM swap attacks. Efani offers military-grade encryption on their product and offers up to $5 million of SIM swap insurance. And to date, there have been exactly 0 SIM swaps on any of Efani's over 50,000 protected accounts. So you don't need to live in fear, you just need to protect your weakest link. Go to efani.com/breedlove to secure your phone line today. Again, that's Efani, EFANI.com/breedlove. For the past 25 years, I've been reading roughly one book per week. Almost entirely difficult nonfiction books, the kind that really shift your thinking. Books on physics, money, power, psychology, spirituality, and philosophy. The real stuff. But I get it. Most people don't have time to read 50 books per year. So I hand-selected my favorite nonfiction books and distilled each one of them into a course that you can take in 50 to 100 times faster than it would take you to read the entire book. Each course gives you the key insights, mental models, and frameworks that matter. We launched with 15 book courses, and we are building toward a library of 100 by the end of year 1. So if you are a seeker of truth, wisdom, and personal growth, then my book course is for you. To sign up, go to course.breedlove.io. Again, that's course.breedlove.io. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.